2024 was set to be a fantastic year in Hollyoaks after widely reported an alleged coup from behind the scenes, which led to exits of executive producer Lucy Allan and 2 others. This was once again allegedly after the cast and crew staged a massive stink threatening to halt production if Allan wasn't ousted. This was universally viewed as a good thing at the time. Lucy Allan's reign was quite a dud, with them often opting to kill off characters with potential rather than broadcasting what was a fairly stacked cast. The stunts were reduced majorly, and she opted for rushed storylines with long-term villains that tracked. One of the more memorable disappointments was the County Line storyline, which had most of the teenagers off their face of ketamine whilst trying to age up Ella Richardson and Charlie Dean, 2 characters who were not ready in the slightest. On the other hand though, you had the rise of Juliet Nightingale and Sid Sumner, who became 2 very popular fan favourites. In a storyline that had too many twists and turns, like young teens Ella and Charlie conceiving a child that never made it to term, turning Ella into a killer, and having Ollie Morgan take Ket for what felt like every week for a year. And the saga that only really fully finished for Sid when they faked out his death and inevitably took down the abysmal Victor brothers. Another example is the Coercive Control storyline that involved John Paul McQueen and stunning PC George Kiss, a storyline that held extremely quickly, even for domestic violence cases, to full-blown assaults, and it progressed so rapidly only for it to close out with quite possibly one of the worst whodunits I have ever seen. The introduction of the Chen Williams family, where they just didn't know where to take them. Serena is initially introduced as Galaxy, who helped Sid come to terms with losing his leg, only for them later to disregard this clear romantic positioning and put him with Lizzie instead. Sam, the man who exposed Dave's infidelity and his cagey behaviour over their mother and became an unhinged ex to Zoe. Honor, a counsellor who didn't really do much counselling, nor had any character building moments. Then you had the family that worked. Mason, the incel, who was radicalised by Eric. A very strong actor who was trusted, but not quite enough. Then Dave, who when the exits were stapled showed similar signs to Cameron and Emmerdale, where he dispatched of Norma and became one of the most surprisingly addictive villains before he died at the hands of Robbie Roscoe. Finally, the true hero of the Chen Williams, Ethan, immediately introduced with Maya, an overbearing, belittling partner, assuming a big villain role, but his chemistry with Stee and Sienna proved to show that his heart was his strongest muscle. I believe it's unfortunately in this period where we had some of the worst acting ever to be put on television, as we broadcast former Strictly star AJ Pritchard and Love Island alumni Curtis, who couldn't sell water in a desert. Between this and the introduction of Fergus Collins, a villain that somehow made Warren his lapdog, not because he was terrifying, just because. Sandwiched between really intriguing stories like Luke Morgan's M&D, the whirlwind introduction of Summer Ranger, which inspired a whole summer of bisexual panic with one of the most toxic but enthralling relationships with Sienna, we would bear witness to the rise and falls of the Nightingales with James at the helm, and rising stars Juliet and Romeo, with Sid Sumner establishing a generation of characters who had remarkable potential. Just a shame that everyone has since left or been killed off. The failed Thoreau experiment where they introduced Toby and Celeste, but almost played into near incest territory with this weird dynamic between the two. They wanted to tell a story that Toby has essentially been built up to be a psychopath, being isolated from loved ones and empathy. Toby would dispatch Lisa Loveday, which would lead Hollyoaks down a scandalous route, as she would claim they had very little duty of care towards black actors working on the show. The remarkable Mizpah Malik and the Dr. Ali Shazad historical sexual assault conviction, and the revelation of my favourite couple that was gone too soon in Love Shack and Verity Hutchinson. Leading to the Moorish Sienna, Ethan, Dilly and Rafe love square with one of the most genuinely shocking twists in Hollyoaks that I've watched.
What? What? No! What? No way!
With its final fantastic piece in a twisted few years being Charlie Dean's mental health storyline, where the depths of the Osborne family was truly rediscovered. Despite my reservations about them aging up Charlie too early, this mental health storyline absolutely knocked it out of the park. The episode where he goes to the beach and tries to end it all is truly unforgettable. It's time to acknowledge that I've tried to give a general view on this time period. As quite like every executive producer we have ever seen in any soap ever, not everything they did landed, but equally there were a lot to enjoy. My personal favourite are the introductions of Ethan and Dilly, two characters who I truly love and will always lament what comes later. Dilly, being Sienna's sister, was a match made in heaven. Dilly had the life Sienna wanted, but Sienna had the connections Dilly never had. Everyone's dynamic was so greatly built up. Ethan and Dilly as besties, while Sienna found the little sister she never knew she had. Then Ethan and Sienna fully clicked, with Ethan being so deeply unserious until the time jump. To me, this is the era of Hollyoaks I often think about. So with Lucy Allan out and Hannah Chiz in the hot seat, should wrap up the pretty rotten Rainroyce whodunit and set sights on the When Worlds Collide episodes, which featured a massive stunt which took the life of Ella Richardson. Featured the returns of Myra, Cleo, Teresa McQueen and Freddie Roscoe. The stunt involved a massive car crash that started because Felix wanted a confession from Mercedes as he knew she was cheating on him. These episodes were a huge victory for Hollyoaks and captivated the audience, leaving them excited for the future. Channel 4 noticed and already wanted the next big stunt stapled in, but the hype would majorly derail on the 29th of February 2024. It was announced that Hollyoaks would reduce its output from 5 a week to 3, and that wasn't all. Channel 4 announced there would be countless cast exits, with no one being safe, as at least 25 cast members would depart the show, and a ton of behind-the-scenes personnel. Some of the most notable exits would be Cindy Cunningham, Tom Cunningham, James Nightingale and Warren Fox. As there were to be so many exits, they opted to go with a different plot device to explain all the cast shuffles. Enter the topic of this video, the time jump. How it worked in reality is the week of the 9th to the 12th of September would be the last year in 2024, and a week later it would be in 2025. The build-up to the time jump would be jam-packed with exits, and it would all come to a head. The rise of Dave Williams as Blue, facing off with a man responsible for his daughter's death, Warren Fox. The demise of James Nightingale after bombs were detonated in his car. The death of Suzanne Ashworth after a fraught year for Frankie Osborne, and she finally accepted that Frankie was telling the truth over her disgusting abuser JJ. It was a true fever dream with such an accelerated pace which hurled us towards the time jump with a massive sense of excitement. The viewers had an eagle eye on exits, defiantly trying to understand who left and who stayed, with a lot of us assuming if they were safe beyond the time jump, they would be staying with the show for good. Right? To not have this video be 2 hours long is a snappy rundown of everything that happened in the missing year. Leah Barnes is pregnant with Dylan Ray, her brother Lucas's boyfriend's baby. Grace Black realizes Rex Gallagher is a half-brother. Jeremy Blake and John Paul McQueen are a couple. Sienna Blake is engaged to Ethan Williams. Charlie Dean has gone to trade school. Leela is pregnant but doesn't know who the father is. Vicky and Ethan sleep together and Ethan convinces her to terminate the baby. Lucas Hay is in Young Offenders for assaulting JJ. Steve Hay is in a coma after the explosion last year. Diane and Tony Hutchison have started divorce proceedings. Perry Lomax and Abe are a couple. Clea McQueen is being held hostage by Abe, but everyone thinks she is dead. Mercedes battles bowel cancer. James Nightingale died in the explosion. And Frankie moved to London, but has returned and now works at Price Slice. So yeah, a lot of people had to exit the show, with some getting rushed, ridiculous exits like Scott disappearing, then ringing Freya and Vicky, saying, "Yeah, I left, lol." It was very exciting to see, with them going at a frantic pace, but unfortunately that pace dried up quite quickly as they entered the era beyond the time jump. The first week of the time jump is one of the most exciting weeks Hollyoaks has had in years. The concept is enthralling, and has us all on the edge of our seats trying to figure out who was going and who was staying. Over the next month, the audience were guessing at who did what has changed and where. Therefore, the pacing was frantic, and led to such a beautiful mystery that everyone was trying to suss out. Everyone wanted to know what families were kept, who exited over the forgotten year, and what this new direction was going to be. However, the cracks were beginning to form. Hannah Cheers was given a very harsh reality to dispose of multiple fan favourite characters and decide who was going to be the future, and it has to happen within 6 months. Therefore, it felt like Cheers was in damage control mode, where she was expected to get to the finish line without too many fouls. You would have expected that this damage control would have worn off once we settled into the new era, but unfortunately it became a key choice with Hannah Cheers, which will go into my next point. Shock value loses value quick. It has been something of a feature of this new era where the Hollyoaks team will have what they think is a cool idea, and instead of grounding it in reality, they will simply look past the plot holes and retcon it. The best example is the butchering of families. So Jeremy Sheffield was fantastic as Patrick Blake, the stern headmaster. But he's dead and we saw him dead on the show. Okay, but what if we brought him back as his bisexual, nicer brother who actually is Sienna and Dodger's real dad? Now you would expect that since they practically brought him back from the dead, they're gonna build the whole family around him and keep him for good. Well, how about make him a serial killer and dump all over history by trying to have him one-up Silas Blissett and the Gloved Hand Killer? Perhaps I'm wrong, but it feels like the only way Jez is going to go is in a body bag. If that is how it's going to end, it's hard to argue that it has all been worth it. Jez's storyline had been mired with controversy. Beyond Dilly, Robbie and Bobby, a lot of his kills have been no-named glorified extras to pad out the numbers. This is aside from all the retcons they have performed in order to fit narratives. Revelations that Rex is actually Grace's kid due to Fraser having improper relations with his own daughter, something that was never even alluded to when we had Fraser and Grace on screen together. The revival of Claire Devine after her being unceremoniously run down in 2013 to now suggest that it was all a big cover-up and she was behind the human exploitation operation. By changing previously established plotlines, you forever add asterisk to history. I'm not against bringing back characters from the dead either. I'm fully content with Kathy Beale, Dan Watson, Cindy Beale, and I'll argue I'm perfectly happy with Claire Devine being back. But the direction of Jeremy Blake, without characterising him as a better man than Patrick, only to fit him as a serial killer and try to belittle Silas in the process, was the incorrect choice. Even more of a recent change they have done is to decide that Morgan Osborn is not Darren's child and is in fact Tony Hutchinson's. This breaks apart the Osborns, for all of which is pure shock value. At this point, viewers might feel reluctant to become invested in a relationship, storyline or idea as it just feels helpless because the current team may throw it out of the window. Shock value is inherently exhausting, and at some point, you just stop caring. Speaking of stopping caring, the time jump was extremely effective at consolidating cast. There were the characters who were effectively dead weight. How many people were truly upset at the exits of Zane Rizwan, Andre Clark and Hunter McQueen? This way you got to rebuild the families, and not have so many lingering pieces. The Osborns, the McQueens, the Hutchinsons, the Blacks, the Lomaxes. It meant you cut out the fat while fully leaning into its younger characters. So many of them have risen to the occasion. Lucas Hay, Vicky Grant, Dylan Ray, and of course the infinitely talented Frankie Osborn. Meanwhile, the foundations of this era have been off the backs of the Hollyoaks legends like Mercedes McQueen, Sienna Blake, Darren and Nancy Osborn and Tony Hutchinson. Soaps can often get too far bloated, and they are very often loyal to stars who have a history behind them. There are very few clean breaks. You may have admittedly ripped out the livelihoods from Cindy Cunningham or Tom, but now it gives these talents more room to breathe and have a greater focus. To avoid all the positives becoming negatives, the Hannah Cheers direction of rebuilding the families was a shrewd move. Despite the number of cast members being lower, the families have felt more compact, and in some instances more down to earth. They have successfully built up the Osborns so much so they won the Soap Family of the Year. The McQueens have had more strings than just Mercedes with the rise of Cleo. Steve and Lucas are still leading stories while the teens are flourishing under this new direction. The harshest of axings. At the end of the day, a lot of people lost jobs, but the majority were dead weight. When you cut the only Hollyoaks actor to win Best Actor at the Soap Awards in over a decade in Gregory Finnegan's James Nightingale, a lot of the core audience will have problems. I will acknowledge that the position James was in at the time of his death probably wasn't his strongest. In a fairly wishy-washy relationship to Stee, and a couple of really bizarre storylines probably left the character in shallow waters, but dispatching him in the way you did really struck a chord with a man who seems to be genuinely shocked at this axing. He has been very public with his disappointment, but at least his hopes were dashed. When you look at who made it through the time jump, you would expect that they would be kept for good. This was not applied to arguably two of the most popular characters, Dilly Harcourt and Ethan Williams. I've been pretty vocal of my enjoyment of these two characters. Dilly, who is the perfect foil to Sienna, and had they not been constantly feuding, they should have been the best of friends. They had this engaging love square between Dilly, Rafe, Ethan and Sienna, with Rafe being the afterthought. This intense chemistry between the three of them, where you want Ethan and Sienna to be happy, then I flocked to Ethan and Dilly. At this moment, they pivoted away from the original story in order to keep Dilly around. We learn that Dilly is actually Patrick's daughter, but was sent away desperately wishing for the father that she feels Sienna took away from her. She has a breakdown, accidentally kills Rafe, and sees Patrick's ghost. This was obviously the start of wanting Jeremy Sheffield back. With her being cleared of Rafe's death, Dilly moved ahead with a life as Sienna's sister, but the first sign of trouble was her horrendous romance with Prince McQueen. A loveless affair. They then made Dilly Sienna's cousin as opposed to sister, and once they embarked on Killer Jez, she was unfortunately one of his first victims. One moment I've never really recovered from, as she was unceremoniously dumped from the show with no warning, and Sienna was forced to conceal the evidence. When I think of characters who have such great potential that we never got to see, Dilly will always and forever be at the top of that list. As for the other soap death I have never forgotten, is Ethan Williams. Considering he started as a gangster type who got Sienna and Stee involved in the criminal world, only to show his heart so much in his sweet and silly scenes with Sienna, friendship with Darren, and the desire to be a great dad to Sienna's kids. They decided to split Ethan and Sienna up for the Rafe storyline, where we got Dilly and Ethan, only for Ethan and Sienna to get back together after the time jump, where as an audience we were delighted that our boy Ethan made it, and made it all the way to the wedding, where he was killed by Sienna. Matthew James Bailey, the actor, was extremely open about his love for the show, and made a comment saying he would do Hollyoaks for as long as the producers would let him. It's just a shame that after he said that, they killed him off in such a heartless way. A short-sighted decision which destroyed two of the fastest rising stars in recent Hollyoaks memory. I feel like everyone has their favourite soap character who was unceremoniously killed off. It's just disappointing that Hollyoaks rattled through two in a short few months. In terms of a positive, Hollyoaks was given a major breath of fresh air. Very few times in soap history you can point to a time where the producer had such a clean break. Hannah Cheers was the visionary behind the Frankie and JJ Osborne sibling sexual abuse storyline. Now some people may argue I harp on about it a lot, but this storyline for me was lightning in a bottle, propelling two soap rising stars in Ryan Mulvey and Isabel Smith, both of whom are probably too good for this genre. Within this very disturbing social issue of sibling sexual abuse, we were introduced to Frankie Osborne, who's characterised as the problem child, while JJ was the golden boy. Little did they realise how wrong they were. Between this and rocketing the Osbornes front and centre, guiding this beautifully tragic storyline. These storylines would form Hannah Cheers' identity, of her wanting to depict these significantly darker issues. The only problem with this direction is what she would put around these major storylines. So you have a massive award-winning storyline with Frankie and JJ, and then you surround it with the introduction of Patrick Blake's cool identical brother Jez. This is where the identity of Hannah Cheers wears off. She will put forward greatness and then surround it with garbage. The peaks have been high, but the lows have been catastrophic. The returns of leading characters. As a relatively new Hollyoaks fan, my peripheral vision of history isn't as wide as a lot of other fans. I've never really watched much of Claire Devine at her peak, and have no real clue how she would acclimatise to this version of the show. Now that she is removed from the human exploitation, we have been allowed to bask in the woman that is Claire Devine. A woman so deeply unserious who finds Stee and Sienna locked up, and instead of doing the good and decent thing, she blackmails Jez for the money he stole from her. wanting revenge on the teens she exploited, and overall her callous and uncaring attitude has made her a major highlight of this new era. Adding Emmerdale legend John Middleton, who played Ashley Thomas, who, despite being a member of the gangster family, adds a level of charm. All of which is rounded out by the addition of Rex and the returning Grace Black, who was callously cut by the previous producer. The return of Dodger after a long stretch away seems to be fully invested in the future. The intriguing update of him becoming a police officer has led to both the more frustrating side of the writers treating him like an idiot, but all is forgotten when he finally realised Jez was a killer as John Paul fell over a floral arrangement. This one could be both a positive and a negative in a sense, because we won't see what happened in the Lost Year. The Lost Year is a tantalising prospect with all of the progression of characters that we'll never be able to see. It is because of circumstances beyond their control, but all of the storylines where we just have a beginning and an end. We don't see Mercedes battle stomach cancer, we don't see the progression of how Cleo ended up locked up, the fall of Tony and Diane's marriage, Rex building his relationship with Grace, a massive year of Ethan and Sienna getting back together. Then, even when they did an episode of The Lost Year, it ended up being so uninspired as the only character they brought in for it was Warren Fox. The final point in this accidentally one-sided argument. Hollyoaks has lost a part of its identity. It always had a strong core, a frantically paced and teen-driven narrative. I used to facetiously suggest that Hollyoaks is EastEnders / Corrie on speed. Everyone in the show is beautiful, and storylines that would last 3 years in other shows would likely last 6 months. It had such a cutting edge with it being able to captivate the messy part of teenage years like no other. With the adjustment in schedule going from 4 30-minute episodes a week to 3 20-minute episodes, it dramatically shifted the tone and pacing. It has somewhat never really recovered to the pacing of old Hollyoaks. When the schedule was reported to have changed, they put a marketing spin on it, suggesting it was a way to tell stories differently with this new means of storytelling. If you look at an episode today and an episode 5 years ago, the only difference you'll notice is the runtime and how much history they've changed. Now, before I make a sweeping conclusion, it's important to state that Hollyoaks did not have a choice. This was thrust upon them by Channel 4, and Hollyoaks had to roll with the punches. I think it was a poisoned chalice, and any producer would have struggled with this role. Their first couple of months before the changes kicked off were going really well. However, once the exit planning started, the wheels really fell off. And with all that said, was the Hollyoaks 2024 time jump worth it? I would have to say no. This series was intended to dish out a balanced take as to some of the most controversial decisions in soap history, and I unfortunately picked the one I have very few positive things to say about. I believe the most strugglesome aspect of the time jump is the damage control writing style that Hannah Cheers has remained in till this day, where they will continue to choose shock plots over long-term future. As a viewer, it feels like the satisfying conclusion to plotlines just become ever so twisted that it feels redundant to let Hollyoaks take your hand for one moment while it crushes your fingers and tell you off for believing it. The relationships have become fodder for storylines, with most of the popular couples being knocked down brick by brick for needless drama or changes to history. Here's looking at you making Tony the father of Morgan. If you're a Cleanna fan or a Hayray fan, it's been a path paved with broken glass and broken dreams. One day, they will be happy, we believe, as Hannah Cheers makes Dylan fall in love with Stee. And Cleo kiss Dodger. What a time to be jaded. The crushing gut punch delivered to the audience by stripping away Ethan, Dilly, James and Cindy. Characters who were arguably removed because they were written into a hole that the Hollyoaks team had guided them into. Cindy, an actress who had given countless years of her life dedicated to the show since 1996, but cruelly had the opportunity removed from her. Almost brutally, you can suggest that she was too versatile as a character, as they just stopped putting family or characters around her. Ethan and Dilly being thrust into our faces, surviving the time jump, only to be cruelly taken away at the first glance. Even James, a character who I'm not particularly in love with, who had dedicated years to Hollyoaks, and it was all over in one unsatisfying explosion, that Stee somehow survived. The almost fumbling of the Frankie and JJ storyline by wanting to fake out the audience by implying he dies, only to have him go to prison anyway. The Cheers approach of having a cake and wanting to eat it too. The dark and damaging human exploitation storyline, where they embroil characters you were supposed to root for in Rex and Grace, then being shocked at the end when the audience does not want to believe in those characters. The lack of depth within the cast, with everyone having to do as much as they humanly can to make the village not feel depleted. Not in terms of talent, the talent is definitely there, but just the amount of bodies you can throw into it at one time. The thought of stunts being involved is a terrifying prospect, because at least if the cast is fairly bloated, it's always a good excuse to close the doors on a few floundering characters. Hollyoaks seems to be reluctant to add longer term characters, rather than short-term stints who will be ended by Jeremy. In fact, the only debut this year has been the aforementioned Fraser Froggy Black Sr. Hannah Cheers and the team have done a formidable job over this harsh reality check they were fed, but at this point in time it feels necessary that someone else take over. Hannah Cheers has made all of the harsh decisions and taken all of the flack, and maybe in a couple years, if Hollyoaks is still on our screens, we'll look back fondly on her time. However, right now, the longer her stint has gone on, the more history is getting changed. I have to give her credit for redirecting Hollyoaks away from disaster, but time will tell. I would argue that a worse job probably would have gotten the show axed, but you never really know with Channel 4. I think it's easy to be swept up in the Hannah Cheers hysteria, where us as an audience are subject to their direction, and at this point perhaps are more used to disappointment rather than satisfaction. But it is the beauty of soap, as we get to spend way more time with the characters we love. And there we are. That is what I'm going to call the pilot of the series called Was It Worth It?, where I take some of soap's most contentious decisions and try to present it in a fairly unbiased manner and help the audience kind of ask you for the question, was it worth it? Now, if you don't really know what I'm saying for decisions like killing off Pat Butcher, killing off Ronnie and Roxy, bringing Den Watts back from the dead, bringing Bet Lynch back after a long time away, these sorts of things, and I would love to see what you think about it in the comment section. And with all that said, do you think the Hollyoaks 2024 time jump was worth it? I would love to know what you think. Thanks for watching. I've been Ash from Watching Walford. See you next time. Bye bye.